Section 2 of Under the Guns, A Woman's Reminiscences of the Civil War, by Annie Wittenmyer. Braving Dangers. In December 1862, General W. T. Sherman gathered his forces at the landing at Helena, Arkansas, and on the 21st of the month, the great fleet with flags flying moved down the Mississippi River. A very strict order had been issued by him against any citizen or reporter accompanying the expedition, and severe penalties were threatened in case the order should be disobeyed. It was well known that the movement was against Vicksburg, but the bravest reporter feared to defy that order. As some time passed without news of Sherman's army, the Blue Wing was sent down with communications, but she was captured by the Confederates. The government finally decided to send down 2 gunboats and the White Cloud, a wooden steamer. I at once asked the privilege of loading the White Cloud with sanitary supplies. Mr. Plattenberg, agent of the Sanitary Commission, who was also at Helena, had a heavy load of supplies. As I had a pass for myself and all goods from the Secretary of War, I had no trouble in securing a passage on the White Cloud. I do not recall as to how Mr. Plattenberg secured the privilege of going with the little expedition. I only know that he went, and that the boat was loaded with our supplies. Thousands of soldiers were about the landing when our little fleet moved out with banners flying. We all knew that untold dangers were before us, and our heroism created the greatest enthusiasm. When the White Cloud moved out into the channel and turned her prow downstream, I stepped out "on the guards" to take a last look at Helena. My appearance was greeted with such an outburst of applause from the thousands on the wharf that I fled to the cabin, after waving my handkerchief in acknowledgment of the salute. We were fired into frequently from the banks. Whenever we reached a point of especial danger, the White Cloud was sent 8 or 10 miles in advance so as to draw the enemy's fire, and thus uncover his batteries; for it was not likely that if the gunboats were in sight we would be attacked. Every moment, night and day, we were in expectation of shot or shell from some concealed battery from the shore; but they had been forewarned that the gunboats were coming, and so did not attempt to capture the White Cloud. The sharpshooters on the shore fired into us again and again. No one was killed, but sleep and rest were impossible, and there were many narrow escapes. We reached Milliken's Bend one morning about daylight, to find General Sherman's army quartered there. There was a great fleet of boats, and the sick and wounded were on them. A tugboat was detailed to me, and I went with my supplies from boat to boat, distributing such comforts and delicacies as I had to the men who had been wounded in the fight near Vicksburg. It was decided by the medical authorities to send a steamer up the river with a load of the wounded at once. The city of Memphis, the largest steamer on the Mississippi River, was selected for this purpose. A regiment and a battery were removed from the boat, and she was put in order; that is, the filth was shoveled overboard. I was told by a chaplain at the time that there were so many of our men dying that the firing of salutes over their graves was ordered discontinued. The constant noise of funerals was demoralizing. During the afternoon the boat was loaded up with the worst patients on the several boats. They were placed in the berths, and under the berths, and on the floor, and out upon the guards. Wherever there was a place where a fever-stricken or torn and broken body could be laid, it was occupied. About 750 were put on board. The sun was sinking behind the long, low line of cypress trees, festooned with their trailing mosses, when our boat turned her prow up the Mississippi River. Long rows of men lay on the floor with their knapsacks for their pillows. Among them was a Missouri soldier, severely wounded and delirious, who all the night long called piteously for his sister. His cry, "Oh, sister!" was so plaintive and pathetic that I would go to him every little while and ask, "What do you want?" "I am glad you have come. I want a drink of water." When the water was given he would remain quiet for a little time. The next morning, as soon as it was light, he was taken to the amputating table, and one of his limbs sawed off above the knee. He sank very low under the operation, so low that no attempt was made to remove him from the table. The surgeon in charge said to me, "Get him to take some food or drink if you can. He is sinking very fast." I offered him every delicacy in my possession, but he turned away in disgust. There had been some of my supplies transferred to this boat. While working with the men on the lower deck, and helping dress their wounds, I found a barrel of sauerkraut. I allowed the attendants to open it, but afterwards, as I came up to the upper cabin, I called the surgeon's attention to it so as not to be blamed in the matter if the results were bad. It happened that I met him near the amputating table. As I passed the patient, I turned to give him a sympathetic look. He beckoned to me, and I hastened to him. "I want some kraut," he said. I stepped over to where the surgeon was ministering to a man, and questioned as to whether it was best to grant his request. "Give him anything he wants. He can't live anyway," was his answer. I sent an attendant down to get the kraut, and he brought a big tin cupful, and placed it on his breast and went his way. Shortly afterwards, passing that way, I noticed him, feebly, ravenously trailing the kraut to his mouth. And I never saw any one eat as much kraut as he did in my life. He never stopped till he emptied the cup. No one attempted to hinder him, as it was expected he would die soon. From that hour he began to mend, and by the time we reached St. Louis his case was considered hopeful. Months afterwards, as I was passing through one of the St. Louis hospitals, I heard the thud of crutches coming after me. I turned to see who was following me, and a merry voice greeted me. "Here's your sauerkraut, man! Here's your sauerkraut, man!" And there, sure enough, was my Missouri soldier, able to get around lively on crutches, and as blithe and merry as though he had never felt the keen edge of the surgeon's knife. The dangers and hardships of that trip can never be forgotten. There were many touching incidents. If this little story falls under the eyes of that Missouri soldier, I would like to hear from him. He told me that day that I last saw him his story, which was full of the pathos of home love and tender sacrifices. He was the youngest of his father's family, and they did not want to spare him to the country, though they were loyal to the Stars and Stripes. But the lawless bands of marauders, who were significantly called "bushwhackers," were prowling over the state of Missouri, and his life was unsafe. He did not venture to sleep in a house for months before he left his home, and at last sleeping in the bushes became dangerous. Several times, as he was asleep out in the undergrowth, he narrowly escaped the bushwhackers, who were seeking him. I never saw him again, but hope he got back to his own home safely. During the trip up to Cairo 20 died, one with lockjaw. It was pitiful to see a great stalwart man deprived of the power of speech, starving to death. Not one particle of food could pass between his closely set teeth. His mind was clear, and daily he wrote out his requests in regard to his friends and other matters. Never was ocean traveler gladder to see the headlands of his own native country than we were to see Cairo. A company of ladies came on board, fresh nurses and surgeons were obtained, also comforts for the wounded in the shape of cots, mattresses, etc. Many of the patients were removed from the overcrowded boat into comfortable hospitals at Cairo, thus relieving all parties. As soon as the boat landed, I went to the house of a friend, and as I had not had 1 hour of unbroken sleep for about 10 days, I redeemed the time by taking a nap 36 hours long. 2 dreadful days on the battlefield. Shiloh. The hospital steamer on which myself and 2 other ladies took passage to Pittsburgh Landing from Cairo, Illinois, reaching Savannah, Tennessee, 8 miles below there, about 4:00 a.m., April 7th. There we heard the news of the terrible battle that had been fought the day before. Some said, "The Union army is defeated and driven to the very banks of the river, and are all likely to be captured to-day." We were soon out of our berths and on the outlook. The boat, with a full head of steam, made all possible speed to reach Pittsburgh Landing. 2 gunboats, the Tyler and the Lexington, lay out in the stream, sending shot and shell over the heads of the Union army into the Confederate ranks. As the boat steamed up to the landing, where already a great fleet of steamers was lying, the shells went screaming over our heads with deafening fury. All was in seeming confusion at the landing. The roadways dug out of the steep bank were insufficient for such an emergency. In the hard fight on the day before, a vast amount of ammunition had been used, and the officers all well knew that with the dawn of the coming day the battle would be renewed with desperate fury. Every teamster was, therefore, doing his utmost to get ammunition and provisions to the front. They would bring their mules to the steep, roadless bank that stood at an angle of 45°, and while the driver held the lines with a strong, steady hand, and set his boot heels as to keep a standing position as he plowed his way to the bottom, his mules put their little front feet down, settled themselves on their haunches on which the wagon rested, and skeeted to the bottom with the driver. It was a wild sight. Each teamster had an assistant who held a torch made of pine. Hundreds of torches lighted up the black night. There was a clamor that cannot be described in the loading up, and a steady stream of loaded wagons going up the hill by the regular roadways. As soon as the first rays of the morning light made objects distinct, the firing began. Both armies had rested, face to face, on their arms, and a hasty breakfast had been snatched of what they could get before daylight, for all well knew that a bloody day was before them. For all knew what a bloody day was before them. Each man, as he lifted his head from the ground where he had pillowed it the night before, wondered if he should live to see the setting of another sun. Our hospital boat was lying alongside of other steamers. The rain was falling steadily. We could hear the heavy guns, the screaming of the shells, the thunder of the battle going on near by. As the light increased, we shivered to see the wounded lying on bags of grain and out on the guards, and the dead, who had been carried from the boats, lying mangled and bloody along the shore of the river. At first we could only cover our faces with our hands in a shiver and chill of agony, in the attempt to hide the horrid sights of war from our eyes. But as we stood there a feeble hand was lifted, and a feeble voice called out, "Say, lady, can't you bring me a drink of water?" Immediately 100 hands were lifted. We could scarcely see them in the faint light of the early morning, but we could hear the voices. "Bring me some water!" "Bring me something to eat!" I called out cheerily, "Yes, yes, we'll help you all we can." It was a great relief to have something to do. We went with gladness to our work. I was the pioneer, and went right on to the boat lying nearest. The surgeon in charge of our hospital boat had gone off to the field. There was no one in authority left on the boat, and we took possession. I had several boxes of canned oysters, and 3 or 4 barrels of crackers, but we soon exhausted these. Then we began on the beef in the storeroom. Barrels of soup were made and distributed. The other 2 ladies made the soup, and I distributed it from boat to boat, and from one to another. Oh, the sights and scenes I witnessed that day! As I was carrying a bucket of soup across a gangplank, an officer met me. He came bounding forward with his sword clanging by his side. "Madam," he said, "what are you doing?" I was startled nearly out of my wits, but I managed to say, "I am carrying soup to the wounded." "Why, you ought not to do that. See here, soldier, I detail you to carry soup for this woman." The soldier sprang forward and took the bucket of soup from my hand, and the officer went on. I never knew who he was. If this falls under his eyes, I want to thank him for his thoughtfulness. On and on all day I went with my assistant, while the 2 lady helpers worked as fast as they possibly could to get the food ready. The distribution of food was very rapid. Men with broken legs and arms and gashed faces would hold out their tin cups or canteens to be filled. The tin cups were easily filled, but the canteens took longer. When they saw us coming they would pound on the floor or on the side of the boat, calling piteously, "Don't pass me by! I am here, lady. Please give me some soup. Please, lady, pour some water on my arm. It is so dry and hot, and the wound hurts so." Without a moment's relaxation the day passed in this kind of work. In the afternoon the gunboat stopped firing, and the news came that the Confederates were driven back. Oh, how much that meant to us all! For through all that morning the boats had their full head of steam on, so that if the army was driven to the river as many as possible could escape by that means. Now and then I would help a surgeon who was dressing some of the worst wounds. My clothing was wet and muddy to the knees and covered with blood, but I did not see it. I had not eaten a mouthful of food since the night before, but I did not know it. I was entirely unconscious of weariness and human needs. It was about 10 o'clock at night when someone asked, "Did you have supper?" This little question called me to the consciousness of my condition. "No," I answered. "I have not had a mouthful to eat since yesterday evening." A surgeon operating near by looked at me earnestly and then said, with a voice of authority, "Madam, stop work immediately. We will have you on our hands next." I was cutting a fragment of a blue blouse away from the arm of a wounded young soldier. I continued my work till the bits of the blouse were gotten out, as far as I could see, then laid on a wet compress. "Oh, thank you," he said, with grateful tears in his eyes. I went back to the cabin of the hospital boat and had my supper. After changing my clothes, I sat down on a divan, feeling almost too weak and exhausted to stir. A chaplain came on the boat inquiring for me. When he met me he seized my hand and began to bellow. I have never heard anything like it. When I saw him I knew that he was crazy. The officers of the boat ran back to see what was the matter, and somehow the surgeon in charge managed to get him into a stateroom and lock him in, and place guards at the door, and the next day he was sent up with the other patients to St. Louis on the boat. Early the next morning I was transferred with the little baggage I had to another boat set aside for hospital workers. My fine dress, which I had worn for the first time the day before, was wet and muddy, and I pitched it into the river. Dr. Grinstead, now living in Washington City, was placed in charge of the boat. The Confederates had retreated toward Corinth, Mississippi, but there was still firing in the distance. Early in the day I went up the steep bank and out on the battlefield. The wounded had been gathered up as far as I could see, but many of the dead were still lying where they fell. Not far from the landing there were some tents. In one of these tents a son of Sam Houston of Texas lay on the ground with others, the gray and the blue lying together. Young Houston was severely wounded in the thigh. I talked with him kindly of his grand, loyal father, and ministered to him as best I could. I saw him many times afterwards, the last time a prisoner at Camp Douglas, near Chicago. If this by any possibility passes under his notice, and he has not forgotten my treatment of him when he was a wounded prisoner, I will be glad to hear from him. I went toward a house on the right, but before I reached it I saw two men coming, carrying a wounded soldier. They had made a seat by clasping their hands, and his arms were thrown about their necks. I went forward to meet them. "Oh, set me down by that tree! I can go no farther!" he cried. They carried him as tenderly as they could, and placed him between the great roots of a very large tree. His breast was bare, and the blood was slowly oozing out of a wound in his lungs. "I am dying," he said. "Can't somebody pray?" Both men were weeping. If he was not a brother, he was a friend. I answered promptly, "I can pray." I knelt there on the damp ground, and taking one of his hands in my own, I asked in simple words the Heavenly Father to forgive and bless. He responded to each petition. I kept on praying till he said, "The way is light now. I do not fear." There was a little gasp, a shiver, and all was still. As I knelt there I closed his eyes and said, "He is dead." "Yes," they answered with a sob. "He is dead, and this is all we can do. We will report the case and have the grave marked." And we turned away and left him there. An hour afterwards I returned that way. It was a most impressive sight to see a dead man sitting there so calmly and peacefully with eyes closed, dead and cold. When I passed that way again, they had taken him away. The country can never pay those who went out and heroically defended the flag. Such scenes as these bring gray hairs before their time to those who looked on. What must it have been to those in the midst of the fight? Johnny Clem, the drummer boy of Shiloh, and the boy hero of Chickamauga, Chattanooga. Johnny Clem, who lived at Newark, Ohio, was perhaps the youngest and smallest recruit in the Union Army. The army historian Lossing says that he was probably the youngest person who ever bore arms in battle. He was born at Newark, Ohio, August 13, 1851, and his full name was John Winton Clem. He was of German-French descent, and the family spelled the name Klem and not Clem. His sister Lizzie, who is now Mrs. Adams, and lives on the Granville Road, near Newark, gives the following statement to a visitor: "It being Sunday, May 24th, 1861, and the rebellion in progress, Johnny said at dinner table, 'Father, I'd like mighty well to be a drummer boy. Can't I go into the Union army?' 'Tut, my boy, what nonsense! You are not 10 years old,' was the father's reply, and he thought no more about it. When he disappeared he had no thought that he had gone into the service. That afternoon Johnny took charge of his sister Lizzie, 7 years old, and his little brother Louis, 5 years old, and took them to the Sunday school room, and left them there. As Johnny did not return, the father and stepmother were greatly distressed, fearing he had gone to the canal and gone in for a swim, for he was an expert swimmer, and had been drowned. They searched far and near to find him, and had the water drawn from the head of the canal that they might find his body, but all in vain. Several weeks passed before they heard from him, and then they got word, through a woman living at Mount Vernon, who had been a neighbor to them at Newark, that Johnny had been there, and that she had sent him home in care of the conductor. It seems that Johnny moved on the sympathies of the conductor, who took him on to Columbus, where he joined the 24th Ohio Regiment; but ascertaining that an uncle was in that regiment, he left it and joined the 22nd Michigan. He was an expert drummer, and being a bright, cheerful little fellow, he soon won his way into the confidence and affection of officers and men. He was in many battles: at Shiloh, Perryville, Murfreesboro, Chattanooga, Chickamauga, Nashville, and Kennesaw, and in other engagements in which the Army of the Cumberland took part. When he entered the army, being too young to be mustered in, he went to the regiment, the 22nd Michigan, as a volunteer, until the battle of Shiloh. When he was beating the long roll at the battle of Shiloh, a piece of shell struck his drum and sent it flying in fragments. He was after that called Johnny Shiloh. He was afterwards mustered in, and served also as a marker, and with his little musket so served on the battlefield of Chattanooga. At the close of that bloody day, the brigade in which he was, being partly surrounded by rebels, was retreating, when he, being unable to fall back as fast as the rest of the line, was singled out by a rebel colonel, who rode up to him with the summons, "Scoundrel, halt! Surrender, you little Yankee!" Johnny halted, and brought his gun into position as though he was about to surrender, thus throwing the colonel off his guard. In another moment the gun was cocked, fired, and the colonel fell dead from his horse. His regiment was pursued, and a volley was fired at that moment, and Johnny fell as though he had been killed, and lay there on the field until it was dark enough for him to slip away unnoticed. At Chickamauga he was struck with a fragment of a shell in the hip. He was taken prisoner with others, while detailed to bring up a supply train from Bridgeport, Alabama. He fared hard as a prisoner. His sister, Mrs. Adams, says, "The rebels stripped him of everything, his clothes, his shoes, his little gun, an ordinary musket, I suppose, cut short, and his little cap. He said he did not care about anything but his cap. He did want to save that, and it hurt him sorely to part with it, for it had 3 bullet holes through it." When exchanged he was given a furlough, and sent home for a week. He was weak and emaciated from starvation, and his clothes were a bundle of rags. He had been absent about 2 years in the army, and was at that time in his 12th year. I did not meet him at Shiloh, but became acquainted with him at Chattanooga, when he was in the hospital there, and saw him frequently when he was on General Thomas's staff. He was a fair and beautiful child then, about 12 years old, but very small of his age. He was at that time only about 30 inches high, and weighed about 60 pounds. At Atlanta, while in the act of delivering a dispatch from General Thomas to General Logan, a ball struck the head of his pony obliquely, killing him, and wounding his little rider in the right ear. For his heroic conduct he was made a sergeant, and his name placed on the roll of honor, and he was attached to headquarters of the Army of the Cumberland. Shortly afterwards he received from Nettie M. Chase, the daughter of Chief Justice Chase, a silver medal inscribed, "Sergeant Johnny Clem, 22nd Michigan Volunteer Infantry, from N. M. C.," which he worthily wears as a badge of honor on his left breast, with other medals. When the war was over, General Thomas advised him to study and make a man of himself. He studied at West Point, but on account of his size he could not enter as a cadet. In 1890 he weighed 105 pounds and was only 5 feet high. His wife Anita, the daughter of General W. M. H. French, U.S.A., is also small and delicate, weighing about 70 pounds. General Grant commissioned him as a lieutenant. He is now captain of the 24th U.S. Infantry, and is stationed at Columbus, Ohio, and holds the important office of depot quartermaster and commissary. He has one son living, who is very like him, only he will be larger. From recent correspondence he seems to be the same kindly, great hearted Johnny as when I first met him at Chattanooga, Tennessee. End of Section 2.